Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. People can hear me at the back. Good. Okay. This is a vast lecture theatre, and I'm really sorry it's not full to the brim. I have had better crowds in the past. But everybody, of course, who is here is very welcome. And today's the last lecture. And you'll see I've got a wonderful slide of Sao Paulo by night up on my title slide. And this is relevant because one of the things which has happened in the last 50 or so years has been Sao Paulo's emergence as a major financial center. So it's very much the center of the financial sector of the Brazilian economy, and of course I can well remember from my trips to Brazil seeing some of these urban centers lit up at night. I think Belo Horizonte was particularly impressive because there were a whole lot of architects or architectural firms in the center of Belo Horizonte. And architects worldwide have this tendency to work right through the night, so the buildings were illuminated all night. Anyway, I'm wanting to wrap up this course by getting to Bolsonaro, but of course it's a history course, it's a capsule history, so I'm picking out certain important events and trying to analyze them. And in the previous 4 lectures, we were concerned with the growth of Brazil as a semi-developed country, a former Portuguese colony located in the tropics. It's also a country facing numerous challenges deriving from its long history, including political weaknesses, division, and continuing military interference with democracy. And the role of the military is a vexed question even today, and I will keep coming back to that one. Now, in the last lecture, we covered the Estado Novo period, which is Vargas's flirtation with fascism, and the successful policy of economic nationalism carried out under Vargas' leadership. But this was all put in jeopardy by the military coup of 1964. The military had been interfering in Brazilian politics right through the 1950s. In fact, not a single one of those elections happened without the military kind of playing some sort of role in the background, organizing the election, approving the result, or putting together a coalition of the parties which they approved of. So even progressive leaders like Kubitschek were very beholden to the military. However, in 1964, for reasons which are still obscure, they decided that they could not rely on the usual technique of having a civilian front man or reach some sort of negotiated settlement with a civilian politician, and they seized power in their own right. And so we had a 21-year military dictatorship, And this is terribly important because it is to the subsequent 21-year military dictatorship that Brazil's current president, Jair Bolsonaro, looks back. We've got to ask ourselves, what is it about the general's years which has a continuing appeal in today's Brazil? Because in other respects, it was not a particularly shining period. And so we need to ask, what is it that makes Brazilian populism so different to that in the rest of the world? Because when we look around the world today, in the last few years, since 2016, we've had this populist wave, which has led to Brexit in the United Kingdom, Donald Trump in the United States. We've had kind of various people arise in Eastern Europe, notably Viktor Orban. And we've had Modi in India and Bolsonaro in Brazil. But the outliers, the people outside Europe, are somewhat different. That is, different from the European populists, but also different from one another. Modi, for example, would never dream of making some sort of appeal to the military. The claims there are Hindutva, about religion, the importance of the Hindu religion and Hindu philosophy. So Brazilian populism stands out as something different, and this needs some sort of analysis, and what I'm going to say today is my attempt at answering this question. One answer is that it combines militaristic authoritarianism with neoliberalism, that is, the market-based philosophy, usually associated with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which has been a major factor in the world economy for the last 50 years. And historically, these two things were not joined, because in Brazil, the generals, insofar as they had an economic philosophy, were nationalists and interventionists. And what they did, which is quite interesting, is they added light industry, particularly industry based on the production of consumer durables, cars, washing machines, fridges, all those sort of things, to the mixture which was inherited from Vargas. So there's a complicated history to unravel here, and it basically comes from the unstable mixture of forces which were assembled to combat the military dictatorship. And there was a major movement, a popular movement, known as the Movimento Democrático do Brasil, which led the way to trying to reverse the military dictatorship. And it was a long uphill struggle, and it joined a lot of different forces, and as often happens, the coalition came apart once they achieved success. The other point which needs to be made about the current role of neoliberalism in Brazil, one also needs to realize that the opening up to the market was not a wholly negative experience. Unlike some other countries where neoliberalism has become a total dirty word. One thinks of, I don't know, Greece or generally Southern Europe. But in Brazil, there were some poor people who benefited, and of course the very rich always benefit. So this is something one also needs to bear in mind, because Bolsonaro is trying to appeal sort of beyond the urban groups who are urban insiders to outsiders in the Brazilian economy, particularly people in the provinces and in the rural lower classes. So this is also a part of the story. But we need first to say a bit more about the regime of the generals. And the particular general who was installed was Castelo Branco. he is an interesting character, long-lived person. He went right the way back to the 1920s when he had been a moderate member of the Tenente movement. I say a moderate member because when he was located in Minas, he was very much responsible for putting down a Tenente rebellion. But by 1930, as the Tenente movement kind of broadened out and recruited more and more people, it was opportunistic, or it was opportune rather, to join the Tenente movement, even if you were a moderate. And so he made the move at exactly the right time, 1930, and was on the winning side in the coalition which led to the emergence of Vargas. But in the 1930s, he pursued a professional career, and a lot of which was abroad. He was a very distinguished military theorist, a strategist who was kind of read with respect by people like Little Hart, and who visited all the various military establishments in Europe and the United States. So he spent a period in France, he spent a period in Italy, he spent a period in the United States. And in World War II, Brazil was the only Latin American country which entered on the side of the Allies. It sent an expeditionary force to Europe when the Allies were driving up the Italian peninsula, and it actually saw some fighting in Italy, in which Castelo Branco distinguished himself as a practical fighting man as well as a theorist. And so, as a kind of grand old man of the military, he was actually chief of staff in 1964, before he became president. He was well placed to lead a military rebellion which depended, unlike some of the earlier military movements, on having the overwhelming support of not just the lower ranks, but also the senior officers. So this is a very important factor about the coup of 1964. And he was so well respected that when in 1964 General de Gaulle came on a scheduled visit to Brazil, there was no question of de Gaulle cancelling the visit because of the coup. And there we have a nice picture of Castelo Branco on the left-hand side of the photo and General de Gaulle on the right-hand side of the photo. They had been allies and friends in World War II, and de Gaulle saw no reason to kind of remove any part of that friendship because of the unconstitutional nature in which the unconstitutional nature of the means by which Castelo Branco had come to power. So we need to now say something about the economy under the military regime. And I've already mentioned the main successes under the military regime, namely the addition to the Brazilian kind of industrial structure of a considerable amount of light industry, particularly the industry associated with consumer durables. Consumer durables, of course, were something which appealed to particularly the lower middle classes. So these are the years when Volkswagen becomes a sort of a national symbol in Brazil, and every lower middle class family acquires a fridge. Now, in addition to the traditional economic problems faced by all Brazilian governments, the military regime faced some new ones, and these were of two kinds. Firstly, there were problems regarding money and the foreign exchanges, which were largely of the regime's own making, notably problems regarding inflation and stabilization. For many years, the Brazilian currency was out of alignment with the international exchanges, either over or undervalued. And so this was always creating kind of problems, and many visitors to Brazil will remember the hassles one had about foreign exchange. And there were also an endless series of plans which were usually named after the minister involved or after the currency unit involved. I remember there was something called the Cruzado Plan, which were designed to deal either with exchange rate problems or to combat inflation. And inflation did reach kind of serious proportions in those years, even before the great inflations associated with the oil shocks in the 1970s. And of course, there were also these novel problems coming from the world economy. Basically, the foreign exchanges became a lot more difficult to manage because of Nixon floating the dollar. Ending the old gold dollar regime which had been established by Bretton Woods, largely in the wake of the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson had not wanted to raise taxes to finance the war, so the war was to some extent financed by inflation. And inflation was, of course, something nobody enjoyed, so there was pressure to revalue the dollar in terms of gold, which they eventually succumbed to, and that put an end to the old system. This new post-Bretton Woods regime was a very important turning point for Brazil, as it was for a lot of other countries around the world. A lot of countries lost considerable kind of sovereignty or decision-making power because they had to worry about the foreign exchanges in a way which they didn't under the Bretton Woods system, which was a system of fixed exchanges. Now, the other big question, of course, was stagflation, a new term coming in the 1970s to denote this unwelcome surprise whereby stagnation could be combined with inflation. In the past, inflation had usually been stimulatory to the economy, and so you hadn't had it combined with stagnation. But this is precisely the strange thing which emerged in the 1970s. And stagflation was a particular danger. I mean, this is a complicated and controversial question among economists, and I'm, as usual, kind of cutting my way through a thicket of controversy. It was particularly associated, of course, with the oil shock, once OPEC started raising the price of oil. Now, naive, knee-jerk Keynesian plans to respond to the supply shock by demand management methods were, of course, not successful, and they also tended to discredit Keynesianism in these years, in Brazil as in many other parts of the world. So although some of my favorite Brazilian economists, like Celso Furtado, are veteran Keynesians, they were the people who lost out. And a new generation of Brazilian economists, some of whom were trained at the University of Chicago, took over. But I think the impact of the monetarist, the neoclassical, the neoliberal economists in Brazil was much less than in Chile. In Chile, the boys from Brazil really took over and were allowed to do the most extraordinary experiments, leading, for example, to the complete collapse of the Chilean banking system. The only way they could rescue the banks was by nationalizing them. So in Latin America, there is a kind of standard joke about the Chicago road to socialism. And this is a very different story to Brazil. In Brazil, there had been kind of free market economists earlier on. One thinks in the 1950s, when there's a long-running debate between the people from ECLA, the Economic Commission on Latin America, and people like Roberto Campos, who was the finance minister in the 1950s. In Brazil, the way had already been prepared. And to some extent, it was also a question of going back to the 19th century, because in the discussions which sort of marked politics in Rio de Janeiro in the 1850s, Brazilians were incredibly interested in the policies of Mr. Gladstone and particularly retrenchment as a preceding measure to reform. And so there was considerable support in 19th century Brazil for free market policies, although in those kind of halcyon days, I think things were not nearly as fraught as they were in the 20th century. So we start getting a debate about the economy under the military regime, and it's a major debate, and it continues right the way through. But I must pause to mention some positive developments which came after 1980 and especially after 1990. One thing which has not been much appreciated outside Brazil is that there was a minor agricultural revolution after the 1980s, caused by the introduction of new crops, most notably soybeans, and the development of agriculture in the Mato Grosso and in some of the other interior provinces of Brazil, where previously agriculture had been very much dominated by pastoralism rather than arable. So we start seeing this extraordinary upward trajectory whereby Brazil becomes a major agricultural exporter, joining a handful of countries like Canada in being bread baskets for the world. This was not something which might have been predicted earlier, where it certainly seemed that traditional agriculture in Brazil, like the sugar economy, was an economy in decline because of soil exhaustion. But a whole lot of things happen simultaneously under the generals, who really did seem to care for their rural base, which made Brazil into a great agricultural exporter, which it still is, although I believe currently the price of soybeans are depressed. Anyway, the other remark to make is that after 1990, we saw a major political transformation. Once the generals fell, once the regime of the hardliners, because, of course, Castelo Branco had sort of rationalized his position in 1964 by saying this was a temporary way of dealing with a crisis. But once the generals were in power, a faction emerged known as the hardliners, the linha dura, I think the word is in Portuguese, who were determined to hang on to power at all costs, and it was these people who needed to be kind of nudged out of position by a series of economic mistakes and political disasters. So democratization happened in 1990. The Movimento Democrático do Brasil was enormously successful, and it meant that Brazil actually became a democracy in a serious sense of the word, probably for the first time. because until 1990, there had always been problems with things like voter registration. In the 19th century, there were major restrictions on who could exercise the vote. There were property and education qualifications, and when a vast majority of the population were illiterate, this meant that the vast majority of the population could not vote. But the kind of schooling which had come in the 20th century, even though in parts of Brazil, in the backlands, it was often very rudimentary and inadequate schooling from the sort of point of view of modernization or idealism or concern for citizenship rights. Literacy did make enormous progress, and the literacy test for voting qualification fell away completely. So democratization was a major feature after 1990, and it had interesting kind of positive benefits for the economy. Once you have a literate workforce, it's possible to give them orders in writing. It's possible to set out instructions for how to cope with emergencies in writing. It's possible to give them maps and plans and all these other sorts of things. So this is a sort of very elementary feature of the thing. What is slightly deeper and is something which is only, I think, currently being understood by economists, is that one finds that democratization increases trust. And once you have trust in an economy, all sorts of things are possible which are previously impossible. For example, it becomes possible to introduce new techniques and machinery, whereas if you try and introduce this too fast or introduce this in the presence of a traditionalist workforce, you are apt to get Luddism and resistance. So one of the side benefits of democratization was increased flexibility. And this has been a major feature of the Brazilian economy from the 1990s onwards. So, my next slide actually, of course, summarizes the argument I've just given. But let's just look at this. I'll see if I agree with myself last night. Although Brazil had seen popular voting all the way back into the 19th century, many factors had restricted expression of popular will, for example, formal voting restrictions tied to property or education. But probably more important were various informal mechanisms ensuring the disproportionate influence of local rural elites. I'm thinking here of things like the organization of political parties. And Brazil tended, particularly from the 19th century, to be dominated by local elites which formed parties essentially on the basis of coalescing around a leader, some local big man who was able to kind of organize his tenants and his family and his cousins and his neighbors to go out and vote for him. And it was very much a question of voting for us rather than voting for a party program. There's a wonderful Spanish election, I think the election of 1924, when the winning slogan was the wonderful, meaningless slogan, "Nosotros somos nosotros," we are us, we are us. And that kind of approach to politics, whereby people went and voted for their group, was very much characteristic of Brazil until the 1990s. Now, what happens after 1990 is that parties based on ideology rather than on patronage appeared for the first time. There are still a lot of parties based on patronage, and of course there is also this interesting intermediate group of parties based on identity. For example, one of the really astonishing kind of growth factors in Brazilian politics has been the emergence of a Protestant bloc. Now, Protestantism was nominally welcomed in the old Brazil. The Marquis de Pombal was very keen on opening Portuguese society to heretics. But right through the 19th century, as Gilberto Freire tells us, the English and other notable Northern Europeans were sometimes greeted with hostility by the Cariocas in Rio de Janeiro because it was thought that the only way to deal with the contaminating effects of heresy was after the heretic had been to your house to sprinkle holy water everywhere. The persecution of Protestants was something which was actually revived under the generals. I remember on my first visit to Brazil, going to Belo Horizonte in Minas, great big city, more than 2 million people. It's built on the cross plan. There are two major roads which intersect in the middle. One day, around about 12 o'clock, I was at that intersection, and suddenly there was a crowd. And there were two young men with guitars. And they started belting away this music, and it turned out to be Protestant hymns, kind of adapted to local popular tunes. And then within 5 minutes, there was a preacher giving a hellfire sermon. And 20 minutes after that, the police arrived because this was all illegal and had to be stopped by order of the generals. This is a very vivid memory I carry with me about the persecution of Protestants in Brazil. But because of the general long-run decline in Catholicism in Brazil, the Protestants have been a major growth area, and they now constitute more than 20% of the population. And they vote as a bloc. So their support for Bolsonaro has been absolutely critical. And yet, of course, there are parties which are these we are us parties. There's still a lot of those, actually, particularly in the outlying provinces, not so much in Guanabara or in Sao Paulo, but this means that you have had continuation in some ways of the old bad habits of political Brazil. That is pork barrel politics, people kind of getting their way on legislation only as a result of vote trading. So that you vote for my bill and I'll vote for yours. It's a great slogan. And the other point to make about this, I think, is that Brazilian politics, especially democratic politics until recently, has very much been dominated by widespread veto power. It's much easier to prevent legislation from going through than from getting legislation to go through. So in a situation where there is widespread veto power, there are lots and lots of opportunities for people to be bought off. This is itself a reason for pork barrel politics and for various other practices, some of which are highly corrupt. So corruption is endemic in Brazilian politics, and this is partly the structure of the system, partly the way the Senate and the Parliament are constituted, and partly the federal system, which allows lots and lots of different fora in which corruption can take place. But in 1990, we had an extraordinary election and Brazil's first fully democratic election produced a surprise result, a swing to the liberal center-left and Brazil's youngest ever president, Fernando Collor. There he is on the left of my slide, and he had been a mayor of a little town in the northeast. He came from a very wealthy family, but actually didn't have that much sort of background in Brazilian traditional politics, and maybe that was one reason why people liked him and trusted him. And he was a very eloquent speaker, and here on the right of my slide, I have a picture of somebody who's a personal hero of mine, Jose Guilherme Merquior. Again, a name which probably won't mean much to people outside Brazil, but for my money, he's probably the greatest Brazilian intellectual of the 20th century after Gilberto Freire. He was a Brazilian diplomat, professional diplomat who was assigned to a number of very important embassies abroad. When he was in Paris, he rocked up at the 6th section of the École Pratique des Études and sat at the feet of the great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, and then subsequently wrote a devastating book about Lévi-Strauss in the Fontana Modern Masters series, which is still a great read. And then a few years later, he was posted to the Court of St. James and rocked up at LSE, where he joined the famous seminar run by the late Ernest Gellner, one of the great liberal theorists of the 20th century. So Merquior was a liberal, an intellectual, a man of great distinction. He was very prolific. He wrote nearly a book a year. He wrote also fluently in foreign languages. He wrote his English books in English. He wrote his French books in French. There's one Italian book, which I think he must have written himself in Italian. And of course, there's more or less a book a year in Portuguese. When I was in Brazil 2 years ago, I was scouring the second-hand bookshops, hoping to find various obscure books by him. Alas, the Brazilian second-hand bookshops are not what they were, and I didn't really come back with a lot of treasure. Anyway, Merquior was, as I said, a professional diplomat, and as well as an intellectual all-rounder. He returned to Brazil in order to support the liberal center-left, and he was, as they say in Brazil, a social liberal rather than a neoliberal. So would have probably fitted quite well into some sort of social democratic slot in Western Europe. But he became speechwriter to Collor, and the future looked rosy, except now what's happened? Here we are. Within a very brief space of time, this administration, born out of the Movimento Democrático do Brasil, was in disarray. Within a year, Merquior was dead, cut off by cancer before he reached his 50th birthday. And he was very much the left conscience of his party. And so the left wing in the coalition which supported Collor lost out to the neoliberals. And increasingly, the neoliberals, who had been a kind of dissident voice in the Movimento under the colonels, came to dominate policy making in the democratic Brazil of the 90s. And within 2 years, Collor himself faced impeachment on grounds of corruption, to which he responded by resigning. So he only served 2 years as Brazil's president. And after that, well, resigning didn't exactly help, because the hounds had been unleashed, and he was indicted and convicted anyway. But eventually, after several years of wrangling in the Brazilian courts, managed to clear himself of most of the charges. This involved a long series of appeals, and I think he became a senator again after 2007. So he's still around in Brazilian politics, but no longer as leader of the party. And in fact, a lot of people are very disillusioned with him. So that's the story of the Collor administration. But the parties in Brazil, of course, regrouped, and the coalition came apart, but there was a regrouping of the coalition, and it was a grouping which moved more to the left. And so the successor to Collor was the effervescent Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a distinguished sociologist. He's known as, from his initials, FHC. So there's a picture of him wearing the presidential kind of stripe on the left. And there on the right is a rather nice picture of him meeting up in Geneva with his friend Nelson Mandela. Cardoso was a fascinating man, again, an intellectual of real distinction, but somewhat to the left of his predecessors. So let's have a little closer look at his trajectory. Cardoso had begun life as a Marxist. In 1950, he studies in Minas, and I'm not sure which the university was, but the important thing is he studied with the great Brazilian sociologist Florestan Fernandes, who was a Marxist, and so Cardoso began life as a Marxist, and his thesis was a criticism of Gilberto Freire's analysis of the effects of slavery on Brazilian society from a Marxist point of view. I say this with some kind of nostalgia, because when I was somewhat younger, one of my colleagues was Associate Professor Sheila van der Horst, who had written the South African chapter in a big book on industrialization and race relations, during which her colleague writing the Brazilian chapter was Florestan Fernandes. And when Sheila retired, she was giving her books away, and I went along to her office, and she gave me this big book. Actually, I think that's slightly exaggerated. She just left the books in the office, and people were allowed to go and help themselves to the books. I can't really say Sheila gave it to me, but there it was, a great book on Brazilian slavery by Florestan Fernandes, inscribed to my friend Sheila van der Horst. I have this nostalgia for the Mineiro School of sociologists. Anyway, Cardoso, however, moved away from straightforward Marxism in the 1950s, and he was best known for the work of his middle years, which developed the so-called dependency approach to Latin American history and sociology, which came out of ECLA, that is the UN-founded Economic Commission on Latin America. I've mentioned several times in this talk how in the series of talks, how in Latin America there is considerable sensitivity, especially on the part of nationalists and leftists, about the dependency of Latin American countries on Europe, the dependency intellectually, the dependency politically, the dependency on technology. The dependency, people developed a whole elaborate theory about why Latin American social development had gone wrong. Basically, there had been no kind of proper nationalist bourgeoisie to lead the way. The local bourgeoisies had been bought off by foreigners. They were, in the technical language of the day, comprador bourgeoisie. They were the middlemen, the agents of foreign economic powers. So most of Cardozo's writings are in that vein. And he also had come back from a distinguished career abroad to participate in the Movimento Democrático do Brasil, but he was part of the Social Democratic wing, and so he came from the left intellectually and politically, and I guess sort of spiritually and personally. All his friends were from the left. And so it was thus deeply ironic that he presided over the most far-reaching attempt to restructure Brazil along neoliberal lines. The assault by the neoliberals on the Brazilian economy in the 1990s just grew more and more intense. This had a whole lot of effects, some of which were probably good, because certainly with industrialization undertaken behind protective tariff walls, you often get industries and individual firms created which are not really viable and are kind of parasitic on the remaining body of the economy, and you actually do want to get rid of these people. And this is, of course, one of the most remarkable features of capitalism, its capacity for renewing itself by shedding the parts which don't work. So the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter famously talked about capitalism being a process which featured creative destruction. And there was quite a lot of creative destruction in Brazil in the 1990s with shedding individual firms which had just been propped up, often for political reasons, but certainly some which were being propped up by the tariff. So Brazilian industry in the 1990s became mean and lean, as they say. And this was probably a good thing, certainly for the workers in those industries who were able to take home increases in their paychecks. But of course, there were other people who were moved onto the social welfare rolls. So not everybody kind of appreciated this process of creative destruction. And the other thing, and this I think was almost wholly negative, was the huge growth, particularly in Sao Paulo, of the financial services industry, which was associated, as is often the case, with a whole lot of scandals, pyramid schemes and the like, and a general increase in personal indebtedness. Personal indebtedness, also indebtedness of firms. So the burden of debt service is very considerable in Brazil, even to this day. And this is a feature which started in the neoliberal 1990s. Well, Cardoso was sufficiently skillful and sufficiently popular to serve 2 terms. And after his second term, the country turned at last to the Workers' Party, the PT, as the initials are in Portuguese, under Lula. Now, it was the 4th time Lula had run for office because he'd been defeated by Melo and twice by Cardoso, but the persistence paid off, and the people in the first election of the Workers' Party were reeling to some extent under the adverse effects of the neoliberal restructuring of the economy. So he was elected, and was a tremendous popular wave of support. And of course, Lula, as a person of an extraordinary kind of career, Cardoso used to claim that although he himself had fairly well-to-do parents, if you went back 3 or 4 generations, you would find that he had an African American in his family. But Lula came directly from the working class, and of course for much of his career was a trade union leader, and was a person who had to sort of put himself through night school and see to his own education. Absolutely extraordinary, gifted, creative individual, a natural leader, but somebody who had effectively been kept out of power for those long years in the 90s because the Workers' Party was not trusted. It contained too many radical leftists. Now, how did things turn out? That's always the question. The intention was good, but often there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. So how did things turn out? Well, the simple description of what happened is that Lula returned to the policy of economic nationalism. And the policy of economic nationalism, as I've tried to suggest in previous lectures, is sometimes dangerous. It really depends if sensible people or senseless people are put in charge. Because you can do really terrible things which are very self-harming in the name of nationalism, but you can also do clever things which allow you to kind of beat the market. And there often is a choice between state-led industrialization and market-led deindustrialization. And so this was the choice which Lula faced, and he managed to get the right advisors and appoint the right people, and so he did a successful round of new industrialization, leading to job creation and improvement in the distribution of Brazil, which, as I remarked the other day, notoriously has one of the most unequal distributions in the world. So the first few years of Lula's first administration were the beginning of an extraordinary success story. Afterwards, he ran into trouble of various kinds, some of which I think was just bureaucratic inertia, some of which was resistance, and some of it was complexity. But the big problem, which happened already when he was 2 years into office, was that his party was plagued by factionalism and corruption. There was a left-right split, or more accurately, I think there was a sort of central group who were determined to get their dirty fingers into the trough, and these people needed to be weeded out, and the process of trying to purify the party resulted in considerable infighting and bitterness. And of course, as is usually the case, a lot of this was cast in ideological terms, although I think that probably it's fair to say that some of it is more a question of getting rid of corrupt individuals. Although Lula was